Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink on this Thursday afternoon. First time guest on Podcast on the Brink, but as I was telling him before we hit record, been really enjoying the content that he and Carter are putting out over on Sleepers Media. If you haven't checked them out on YouTube, doing a ton of college basketball, even some NBA draft centric content. Greg Waddell, first time on Podcast on the Brink. Welcome into the show. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much, Alex. Appreciate you. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
So, some breaking news in the Indiana news sphere yesterday. Langdon Hatton commits. I know you've been pretty vocal kind of on your thoughts on the offseason that Indiana's had. We're going to get more into that as we go along here. But that, obviously not a big name. I'm from Southern Indiana, so I knew of him when he played in high school basketball down here and started out at William and Mary, goes to Bellarmine. But not necessarily in terms of the name value on the level of some of the other transfers that Indiana brought in, but in terms of a need, the Hoosiers definitely had a void in the post in the backup position behind Oumar Ballo. I mean, what do you think this kind of does just for Indiana's roster as a whole, being able to solidify that backup spot behind Ballo and, have 12 players now? It kind of feels like Indiana can, with that last spot, just see where things shake out and go from here. If there's maybe somebody shakes loose late, you take a chance on somebody.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't hurt. I have been a huge fan of basically everything Mike Woodson has done this offseason. And, you can kind of go ad by ad through the big names, even down to like a Luke Goody. And I think each one of them was arguably like an A grade ad for me. Like, they all fill a purpose. They all will find the court game in and game out. And they all, I think, mesh together really nicely. To me, I've been a little down on the Hatton ad, to be completely honest. It's not that he's a poor player for what he's going to be asked to do. It's more that I am surprised that Woodson and staff were not trying harder to get additional shooters versus a third string big. And I get it. Like, you need depth. You never know what's going to happen. Injuries happen. And it certainly doesn't hurt. Like, having a true backup big that may not play every game is not a bad ad by any means. But I guess my hope would be that they're not done, because after the Goody ad, I really felt like they're one more Luke Goody level perimeter threat away from feeling like they have everything. And while this solidifies the front court rotation, like you said, I don't think it gives Indiana anything they didn't already have on the roster other than injury secure feelings if Ballo or Renew goes down.
Yeah, I think the one kind of thing, just from talking to people, that I think a lot of programs probably run into this at this time of year, when your roster is almost set and you're trying to go add other names. I mean, these kids are smart enough to know they can look at a depth chart. They can say, like, where are my minutes going to come from? I think from an Indiana perspective, when you look at what they already have with the guards and the wings, there was some talk of Alex Hemingway, the Clemson guard, maybe looking at it. He ends up at Vanderbilt. And when that name was tossed out, I was like, well, it makes some sense. He's from Indiana. He'd be a potentially good ad, but where is he going to, like, how is he going to get minutes? And I think that's kind of the thing that you run into. So while I agree with you that they may need, if there's something out there that can help them, sure, go after it. But on these backup guys, like, if you're going to come in and be the 10th or 11th man in Indiana, or you can go somewhere else, maybe at the mid-major level, and get a chance to play. I mean, that's a hard hill to climb over, I think, if you're the coaching staff, to get a guy to latch onto that.
Yeah, no, 100%. Look, it's hard because, like, we cover so much of the Big Ten on our channel, and like I often run into this where I try to praise every single decision or criticize every single decision as its own unique thing, right? Like, I still love Indiana's class. To me, they had the best offseason of anyone in this league. This just really is the first one where I don't think anything additive came from this other than security. And by all means, that's not a bad thing. To me, like, I think on paper, you shouldn't be hoping that Langdon Hatton is in the rotation. Like, to me, that would mean something went wrong. It's cool. Like, he's a state of Indiana kid. I don't think he was bad last season by any means at the level he played. Honestly, I would compare it to the ad Michigan State just made of Sisman Zapala, who was like, "Oh, we got depth. We're always going to have a true big on the court, no matter what." Now it's like that's great, but Michigan State still needs a good center. It's easier to swallow for me with Indiana when you have the best center in the league. Your backup center, in theory, should just be Malik Reneau, who's awesome in his own right. And I think as long as those two stay healthy, you probably won't see a ton of Langdon Hatton, but insurance is never a bad thing.
So you kind of led me into the main topic of this podcast and why I wanted to have you on, because you and Carter do such a great job of covering every Big Ten program, and I do mean every Big Ten program. You guys cover it from top to bottom. But the winners and the losers of the offseason in the Big Ten, it's interesting. I did a ton of work on Inside the Hall in terms of just trying to track the rosters and keep on top of who's going to be on each team, because it's hard now with all the transfer portal movement to know on a year-to-year basis who's going to be on each team. And you've already said that Indiana, in your eyes, has had the best offseason. What gives you that opinion on just why Indiana has had the best offseason of any Big Ten team thus far?
Well, from a starting point, I think you got the best player. I think Umar Ballo is that good. And honestly, somewhere along the way, like I think it kind of has gotten swept under the rug how good I think he is. Like I loved the ad when it first happened. I was psyched about him as a player and what he can do in the Big Ten. But then it felt like in passing weeks, people just sort of forgot about it. And it's like, oh, Woodson's doing the too big thing again, whatever. I haven't forgotten about it. I think Umar Ballo is, like, without question, the best center in this league. And people, I think skeptics would kind of point to number stuff and say, oh, okay, he's just like a 12 a game guy. He's horrible from the free throw line, whatever. My pushback on that would be like, Umar Ballo is a walking double-double that not for 1 second has ever been a featured player at Arizona. And all he's done is anchor winning teams. I mean, Arizona has won a ton of basketball games. This isn't Khalil Ware, who was super talented and had a great year, but he carried a ton of like, well, can you build a winning team around him? Does he have bad habits? Like, there's none of that with Ballo. For the 26 minutes that Ballo is going to be on the court, he's going to get you 10 plus rebounds. He's going to get you 12 to 15 points without running a single play for him, just because of how physically dominant he is. I love it. I just think, like, even if you stopped there, if that was like all a team needed and Ballo was it, that's a humongous addition. But then you consider everything else they added. Like I was so critical of the backcourt last year coming into the season, and I've never been a Xavier Johnson believer. Obviously, that's easy to say in hindsight with how his season went with the injuries. But like, I think Woodson learned his lesson, where last year it felt like, okay, he swung and missed on a few targets, but you know what? I believe in Xavier. It'll be okay. We have a guy. And this year, he made sure he went out. He's too deep at every position that you could possibly want, right? Like, all you need is one of Miles Rice or Cannon Carlisle to be really good, and this team's awesome. God forbid if both are. Like, I just think there's such an upside here. And to bring Galloway back, Reneau back, and Mbako back too, all three of those guys that could have had decisions in their own right, whether it was just to move on or to go to the NBA or to potentially hit the transfer portal. I just think, especially like beginning of the offseason, I know I'm rambling, but like it was so low. I know you know this. It was so low. There was the thought of like, is Woodson even going to come back? Are the players going to mass exodus? Liam McNeely decommits. And it looks dire. And to spin that a month and a half later into the no-brainer best portal class in the league is like wildly impressive to me. And I think it's definitely overdue to give Mike Woodson his flowers.
Yeah. The biggest change from this offseason compared to last year, they were betting on a ton of unknowns. Xavier Johnson, you don't know how he comes back from an injury. Khalil Ware, he worked out well, but he was a risk to take. It's not like he set the world on fire at Oregon. You're betting on the talent. It worked out. And then in terms of the backup guys, they were betting on Caleb Banks and CJ Gunn to actually progress and get better. Those guys are gone. Peyton Sparks is gone, and they've replaced all those minutes with guys who have actually produced at the high major level of college basketball. So that to me is the most impressive part in all of this is just like you said, going too deep at every position. I want to go back to something you just said though about like how low it got. Obviously, you're not on the ground covering Indiana on a day-to-day basis, but like somebody from afar that covers the Big Ten, you watch all these games. Are you surprised at like where Indiana is now compared to a couple of months ago when it was like when Liam McNeely decommitted and they're having to come out and say Woodson's coming back? It felt like the offseason could really go one of two ways. Like it was either going to be Woodson's going to be a lame duck coach going into next year because he flunked the portal and it was a complete disaster, or he could knock it out of the park. I think it was really up for debate in a lot of people's eyes, like which way it was going to go, and he's knocked it out of the park. And I'm just curious, like your reaction to how it's gone, and if it was surprised you at all.
Yeah, I would say I'm pretty stunned with how quick the turnaround has been. And really it feels to me that Woodson and staff learned from their mistakes and changed the strategy this season. Like I obviously they swung for big swings last season too. They just missed. It helps when you hit your big swings early, but just positionally, I feel like they prioritized different things this offseason than they did last year a little bit. And I give him credit because I wouldn't consider myself a huge Woodson believer. I'm also not a huge Woodson skeptic, but I think you can look at the coaches that are either struggling in this portal NIL era in the Big Ten, or look at the coach of the team that I root for, Juwan Howard, who was in and out. Juwan had a horrible offseason, the Terrence Shannon swing and miss offseason, and then he didn't learn from that mistake. He did the same thing the next summer with Caleb Love, and that's what drove the program off a cliff. And I think Woodson has done the exact opposite, right? It would have been easy to sit here and say, oh, McNeely decommitted. This roster looks empty. The players have lost faith. What are you going to do next? It would have been super easy to make the same mistakes he did last year. And instead, I think it started with player retainment of the guys already on the roster. I mean, to get Galloway at senior day to say, this is my coach and I'm coming back, to, I mean, persuade Mbako back, I think is massive. He should be a breakout star this season based on how he finished the last couple months. Yeah, I think it's impressive. It is a bit shocking. And I say it all the time. Great coaches have bad seasons. You can't find a coach in the country anywhere, in or outside of the Big Ten, that doesn't have a down year. It's about how quickly do you course correct. Like last year, Bill Self finished 27th on KenPom. They weren't in contention for anything. They're going to be the preseason number one roster in the country next year because he course corrected from his mistakes last year. And I think that's exactly what Woodson has done.
So I want to dig into the rest of the Big Ten now. Who in your eyes would you also put in the positive or the winner category for the offseason thus far? I mean, maybe you go to Michigan because of the coaching change and what they've been able to do, but I'm just kind of curious, give me some teams and we can maybe talk about each one, but who sticks out in your mind in that category?
Yeah, I think there may be bias here, but I think it's Michigan and Indiana that had the two best. And it's also probably a bit easier to grade them as the best off seasons when they each had a ton of openings to fill.
Yeah.
Like it had Michigan only needed to go get 3 players, we probably wouldn't be talking about this the same way. But what's impressive to me about what Dusty May has done quickly is, by all accounts, he was not winning bidding wars for the guys in this class. Like Roddy Gale, Danny Wolf, and Vlad Golden, to me, are each very high quality Big Ten starters that, based on the going rates of a guy like Chucky Hepburn to Louisville and AJ Hogard, what he's rumored to get at Vanderbilt right now, I mean, Dusty signed those 3 guys for less than half of what those players are currently going for. That's wildly impressive to me, and hopefully not a sign of what he's going to have to do every offseason. Like you would hope the NIL offering at Michigan improves a little bit once people realize Dusty May is competent as a head coach. But I think like to go from how low Michigan was when Juwan left and how talent depleted it was to feel like you've got 6 guys that are playable right away. Even the ads I'm not super high on in the class, like Trey Donaldson was a starter on a 2 seed at Auburn in the SEC. Sam Walters, a really high pedigree talent kid coming from a team that just played in the Final Four that has 3 years left. So I think there's a nice mix of guys that are ready to establish a floor in year one and also some guys with upside down the line. But outside of those two, I mean, those are the obvious ones because they filled so many spots. I really like what Maryland did too. I think I would compare Maryland's previous season to Indiana's as far as results go, where I think Maryland was probably expected to compete last year, and very quickly you realized there was no spacing and just the mix of players didn't really work. Deshaun Harris-Smith wasn't ready for what was needed of him. And, you wanted to retain some of the pieces that you retained, like getting Julian Reese back is massive for Maryland when he could have gone to the portal. I think Harris-Smith, you could have convinced me either way. It could have been good for him to depart, but it's a talented kid you still believe in. And most players, like when you're a high pedigree talent like Harris-Smith was, if you have as disastrous of a freshman year as he did, most of those guys just leave and want a clean start. So I give Willard and Harris-Smith some credit for let's stick this out and let's figure out what happens here. But they got their Jameer Young replacement. Jacoby Gillespie was a stud at Belmont, and his numbers are really similar to what Jameer Young's were before he came over to Maryland in the first place. And outside of that, there's 3 other guys in this class for him. Selton, Miguel, and Rodney Rice are shooting upgrades from what they had. So I think it's a nice mix for Maryland of bringing back the talented pieces you still believe in and hopefully supplanting them with some better fits around them.
When you look at the guys that transfer up, it's not always a sure thing that they're going to pan out, like a Jacoby Gillespie at Belmont. Obviously, you can project him. He was a really good player at that level, but coming to the Big Ten, there's a ton of examples. Even Michigan's brought in some guys that have, I think they brought in a kid from North Texas that they're expecting to play a pretty big role. When you're looking at these players, talking about them all the time, like when you're looking at a guy who's moving up a level, is there a way that you look into the numbers or what you look for in a guy to say whether or not he's going to be able to successfully transfer up?
It really is hard to find a correlation between guys that work and guys that don't. And I've struggled with it because it got into this cycle, especially with my Michigan teams, where you missed on one high school recruit at point guard, and now every single year you're bringing in a grad transfer point guard, and it worked early. Like Mike Smith was great, and they were a 1 seed that year. And then you get Devontae Jones, and he's not as great as Mike Smith, but he's good. This is still working. And then you get Jalen Llewellyn, and he's a disaster and tears his ACL, and then your season's over. So
right.
And there wasn't I think Llewellyn arguably was the most impressive of those 3 prospects prior to Michigan and what he did at Princeton. So I have really struggled. I think a lot of this is a crapshoot. You never know how a kid is going to react just to changing circumstances. These are still 18 to 22-year-old kids that are young and immature and have probably been, in comfortable situations in the past to something brand new. And there's money involved now, and there's different motivations than just basketball. So I think for me, especially at guard spots, you want to see at least a player that isn't going to be physically overwhelmed. And I think that's a trap because the size and speed of the high major level in the Big Ten, especially with all these big men running around, guards can just get eaten up if they haven't played around athletes or people of that size. So, but you have seen it too. I'm sure you're familiar with this. It seems like guys with multiple years of eligibility are the key to this, because a guy like Tyson Walker at Michigan State, he was pretty horrible his first year. He couldn't beat out sophomore AJ Hoggard. And all of a sudden he comes back his junior season and he's like an all-conference level player. His senior year, he's one of the best guards in America. Jalen Pickett, another one where year 1 was okay. Year 2, he's the player of the year in the conference. I would look for that because I think the adjustment hits everyone, no matter how good or bad you are. If you're coming up a level, it takes almost a full year to get comfortable. And if you have multiple years, you can really unlock something special.
Yeah, with Walker too, with the rules as they are now, he probably doesn't stick around for another Michigan State the second year, because now you can just bounce around every year, and him sticking it out, that really kind of made them, not that they've been good the last couple of years by Michigan State standards, but without him, think about what they look like the last couple of years. There's a couple other teams that I just want to ask you about. Michigan State was actually first on my mind because I'm looking at Bart Torvik's rankings for next season. They're 18th. He's got them ahead of Indiana, which to me is just a little bit of a head scratcher based on the rosters, comparing them 1-to-1. And you mentioned they still need a center. I know Xavier Booker could potentially be that guy, but we've not seen it consistently enough. And they've obviously got some holes to fill. Malik Hall's gone. Tyson Walker's gone. AJ Hogard's gone. I mean, 18 seems a tad high for what? Am I missing something here?
You're not. Most Michigan State fans and people that cover the team would tell you the same. They don't think this is a top 25 roster on paper, but it's one of those classic Michigan State conundrums. And, you have to give Izzo the respect he deserves because the man just doesn't miss the NCAA tournament. Like a bad year for him is the last couple of years, and they're still an 8 seed or whatever they were last season. So, I'll be stunned if they're not competitive. But this team has more unknowns than most of the Michigan State teams you've seen in the last 2 decades. Like, really, Jaden Akins has to be the leading scorer on this team for them to live up to a top 25-ish roster. And, I mean, he scored 10 points a game last year, and he really didn't take a leap at all from who he was his sophomore season. So it's hard, though, because so much of what happened with Michigan State in the past couple seasons was the fact that they played through AJ Hogard and the fact that Madi Sissoko was their center. And Hogard was a really polarizing guy because by all accounts, he was not a good leader. He was not a great locker room guy. He made some head baffling on-court decisions as much as the off-court stuff. But he was still such a prolific assist guy that you almost had to play through him and the ball needed to be in his hands. So I think there could be some just addition by subtraction a little bit in the theory that, okay, maybe Jaden Akins is going to be a lot better because the ball is going to be in his hands more. And we've never seen that. We've seen him be relegated to a catch and shoot role. But outside of Akins, everything's unknown. I mean, Jeremy Fears literally got shot last offseason and his season ended. He looked promising before that, but you have no idea how he's going to respond. He hasn't played basketball since last December. And as good as Xavier Booker's potential is on paper, the fact that he couldn't earn minutes on last year's team is a pretty major red flag given who the front court options were. So a lot will be asked of those young guys. I think most Michigan State fans are okay with that because they just want to see what guys like Fears and Booker are made of. But I think there could definitely be some bumps along the way as Izzo tries to turn them back into a competitor.
One other team that's interesting to me just because of how things ended last year, Ohio State. Surprising to me that they ended up going with Diebler. I guess maybe not surprising considering the way they finished the season. Obviously kudos to him for turning around what was a pretty difficult situation. I mean, they for a while there they were almost like on the bubble, and they had a strong finish to the season, but they had quite a bit of roster turnover. You had the rare transfer that came back, Michi Johnson coming back into the fold there. I think he's a nice pickup for them, but they're also counting on some guys who I don't want to compare them to Khalil Ware, but Aaron Bradshaw and Sean Stewart. I mean, those guys are McDonald's All-American, 5-star top talents that didn't really necessarily have great seasons at their first stop, and they're coming to Ohio State trying to prove themselves and maybe rehab their image in the eyes of the NBA. What do you think of Ohio State, kind of just not just the roster, but the coaching change and how all this looks next season when they get on the court?
Yeah, I'm skeptical. I'll be honest. I think the team has talent, but talent hasn't been the issue the last couple of seasons at all. And it was clear. I mean, you couldn't have kept Chris Holtmann given the way the last 2 seasons went. And I really like Chris. I still think he's a good basketball coach. He's a great guy, but man, those teams underachieved, and there was no getting around it. With Diebler. My big issue with Diebler, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, and you obviously need to see where it goes. Personally, if I were coming off like a 2-year stretch where everyone agrees we need to wipe this clean, this is unacceptable, I wouldn't hire anyone associated with it. Like Jake Diebler's been in the room for all of this, and it's very rare to me that it's just like, oh, the head of the snake was the toxic guy. Cut him and everything will go great. I don't think that's true. I think the whole staff failed, and Jake Diebler was a really big part of that. So if you look at the last month of the season, yeah, they turned it around big time, but it was really just players making shots. I mean, the 3-point splits for them were night and day from right before they fired Holtman to when Jake Diebler took over. I would be pretty skeptical as an Ohio State fan. And I think I didn't expect him to get talent in as quickly as he did. I mean, I would agree with you. Stewart and Bradshaw are high pedigree guys, and they're worth the gamble because you have to start somewhere. I think Ware, even you could tell, even though he had a similar start at Oregon, Ware had a lot more skill than these two guys do. But man, Bradshaw is physically imposing, and Stewart, I think, is a complete unknown because he barely got off the bench. So, give him the benefit of the doubt. The team will be top half in the league in just talent on the roster. I really didn't like the Meechie Johnson decision, though. Like the classic, like started his career at Ohio State, left, and now he comes back. To me, Meechie is a worse player than Roddy Gale. And I don't know what happened behind the scenes with Bruce Thornton and Roddy Gale. Maybe it just didn't work and they needed a fresh start. But I think it's a little clunky to pair Meechie with Bruce Thornton together.
So let's get to the kind of the negative side of the ledger. There's some teams I think that kind of fit the bill that had rough off seasons. Who was on your list for maybe the losers in the off season for the Big Ten so far?
Outside of the ones we talked about, I think you could argue everybody else is up here because I think what we're really seeing, and it's kind of a good statement or a conclusion on the state of the league as a whole for the last decade. People always ask, like, what happened to the Big Ten? Why are there less contenders than there were in the mid 2010s, right? Like, most of this to me is like the coaching, and the guys running these programs are a lot more unproven than they were when we had Thad Matta and even Tom Crean and John Beilein running around. So,
or Izzo at his peak.
Or I mean, Bo Ryan before he left. Right. Like it went from the league that I think had the best coaches in America to like Matt Painter and Brad Underwood and a bunch of guys who don't want to use the portal and don't have NIL offerings. And I think that honestly, that's why the door's open for Mike Woodson to revive things, because he's going to get really talented rosters in here while other programs don't use the tools at their disposal. But anyways, all of that to say, outside of Indiana, Michigan, Maryland, to me, almost every other roster in this league got pretty ravaged. And I guess Purdue didn't lose anybody other than graduates, but
I mean, UCLA, if we're going to count them, I think they count probably as having a solid offseason, right?
That's true. They did get. It's tough for me to buy anything with Mick right now because he went all in on the overseas guys, and it just failed so spectacularly. And now it's like, okay, I'm supposed to buy that those were the problem guys, and Sky Clark is going to fix things. But I don't know. I just the classic Big Ten teams, at least the non Pac-12 editions,
right?
Like
to me, like Wisconsin stands out as a definite loser. I mean, they I almost felt bad for Greg Gard listening. Like there was a couple of clips that were on social media, just him talking about like Storr and Hepburn leaving for like these big paydays, is basically like admitting like we don't have the NIL to keep these guys. And that's kind of the same thing that you're seeing at, potentially Minnesota as well. I mean, Ben Johnson came in last season on the hot seat and earned himself another year with a pretty solid year. I mean, they weren't a tournament team, but they were at least kind of in that conversation and were better than most expected. And then Cam Christie, he's in the portal, probably going to go pro after a year. Pharrell Payne leaves and Elijah Hawkins leaves. And it's like now you talk about a program that's trying to fill gaps with up transfers. I mean, look at the additions that Minnesota has. I just don't see how it ends well for him. And I'm not necessarily saying that's an indictment on Ben Johnson as a coach. I think it's more of an NIL problem at some of these schools too that are near the bottom of the pecking order, at least in terms of picking up transfers.
100%. No, I think you could apply that same sentiment with Wisconsin losing Hepburn and Storr to Minnesota losing Pharrell Payne, maybe Cam Christie if he ends up in the portal, Elijah Hawkins. Iowa, like Tony Perkins went and just got a payday. Right. a guy who should have been your best player. Rutgers loses Cliff Amorie. There's nothing they can do about it. I mean, can you imagine?
And they still don't have a big man, right?
No, they have nothing. And it's like, I'd be so frustrated as a Rutgers fan because you have this generational recruiting class coming in and you're going to start a complete unproven something that's not even there as of May 16th at center with them. Like, and you're right. To Greg Gard's point, I don't think there are answers for these programs because Wisconsin basketball is not going to magically wake up with a $5 million NIL budget. So this is really, it's kind of an indictment on the league at a really pivotal point in the league's history right now as these new schools come in, because teams that have been middle of the pack to NCAA tournament level consistently are not adjusted to this new era. And even you look at the top outside of Indiana, like Tom Izzo is refusing to play this game. He's refusing to play the game. Everybody knows they need an upgrade in talent at the 5, and he straight up didn't recruit one for the 5th consecutive offseason. So it's hard to say they're going to get back to where they were. Matt Painter is actively saying he doesn't want to use the portal, even though he just used Lance Jones to get to a national championship game. So if the whole league, even the best coaches, the Hall of Fame coaches in this league are refusing to play this game, to me, it's a massive open door for guys like Mike Woodson and Brad Underwood, if he sticks around in this league long term, to kind of become the faces of it. And the resource-laden schools are the ones that I think will have the most success.
Is that just a pride thing, do you think, with Izzo? Like refusing to adapt to this? Because it's, anytime, and he's great with the media. Like you watch press conferences on a week-to-week basis, like Izzo gives a ton of time. He answers questions. He's not afraid to give his opinion, but it is just kind of weird that I heard you and Carter talking about this, which I don't know the name of that. You mentioned that guy's name earlier, but that just committed. It's like they go out and get this guy that is not going to make them better, and they know like the last couple of years they needed a better center, and it's like the old Michigan State that I grew up watching in the early 2000s. I mean, I was at the 2000 national championship game. Like those teams were built on toughness, defense, they had multiple guys at every position, and it doesn't feel like, sustainable in the new era to just go out and recruit freshmen and then try to develop them, because some of them are going to leave and everyone else is recruiting older players, and you're going to try to, like, even watching Xavier Booker last year up close against Khalil Ware, it was like a total mismatch. I was at that game at Assembly Hall. I mean, he started the game and they had to take him off the court within like the first 5 or 6 minutes because Ware was completely dominating him. And so this is what you're counting on for next season when you have the choice to go out in the portal and get a grown man that can actually help you win games. And it's not like I don't think Michigan State's hurting for NIL resources either. I think if Tom Izzo snapped his fingers and said, we need $500,000 for a center, like he'd have the money tomorrow.
100%. Yeah, the money is there from what I've been told. And that makes it more frustrating. And it will lead, like, truthfully, it will lead to a bit of an uprising the moment they don't make the tournament. And now maybe he's a magical wizard that could take you and I and 3 of our friends and get to the tournament every single year. If that happens forever, he'll coach for 2 more decades until he's on his deathbed. But the first moment where Michigan State is no longer Michigan State and they're in the NIT, or they turn down an NIT bid because he refused to use the resources at his disposal, it's going to get loud from Michigan State fans who are already frustrated with the state of things. But I think it's a complicated answer to just summarize it by saying it's being stubborn, because I think Tom Izzo feels the right way about a lot of these things, like the values that he believes in and wants to instill in players and doesn't want to lose in this era of college basketball are all good values. All of them are. It's a family atmosphere. It teaches kids to not run from their struggles. It's believing and creating a true family that's always going to be there for each other and builds lifelong bonds outside of basketball. That's Michigan State under Tom Izzo. It's special. But there crosses a line where at a certain point it's just hurting the product on the floor. And I think in the last 5 years, their best 2 players to put on a Michigan State uniform have been transfers. Tyson Walker was a transfer. Joey Hauser was a transfer. those guys did not hurt the culture. They were not some statement on what's bad about college basketball. They were simply guys that filled needs that his roster didn't have. And it doesn't make sense to me why the center spot hasn't been addressed. From what I heard, it became Jackson Kohler or a transfer. Like that was the conversation. Either he was going to make a promise to Kohler or he was going to let Kohler walk and get a new player. He begged Kohler back, and here we are. Maybe that'll work out. Maybe Kohler will become something completely different than what he's been, but I would bet on the other side happening there.
Last thing before we wrap up, I just, you're obviously up in Michigan. You're a traditionalist in the Big Ten. You've seen this league grow and change and evolve over time. And, I admit, I wasn't even a fan when they brought in Nebraska, Penn State, Maryland, Rutgers over the year. To me, it's, obviously this is all about football. We know that. But from a basketball perspective, adding these 4 teams from the West Coast, like how do you think this changes the Big Ten next season from a basketball product? Does it make the league better? Like the scheduling is complete disaster at this point, trying to play. I think you get 3 double plays. I don't know how you get an equitable regular season champion when teams are playing each other for the most part once, and then you also have a conference tournament where there's going to be 3 teams left at home. I got a lot of blowback on Twitter when our X, whatever they're calling it now, like when I kind of ripped that decision. But it's like, to me, the conference tournament, no matter what season you had, you now have a chance to redeem yourself and give yourself a chance to play. And now I know there's no easy way to do it with 18 teams, but to just say, all right, because of football, we now have this 18 team league, but for the basketball tournament, we're now going to throw 3 teams to the side. Like, your season doesn't matter. Your season's over. You're not coming to the conference tournament. That drives me nuts. So, a lot to unpack there from what I said. I just want to give you kind of the open mic. What do you think about this Pac-12 addition to the league and how it changes things from a basketball perspective?
I'm right there with you on how, just for lack of a better word, stupid it is in practicality with some of the changes here and how it impacts basketball. I couldn't agree more about wanting every team there. It always felt like it was a celebration of the season. And no matter how bad you were, it still mattered that you were there and you had this clean slate of what if one magical week happens. 2 years ago, Chris Holtman almost made the final after a year where they were horrendous. And had he done that, it would have, it would have changed everything for him career trajectory wise. So I don't like that, and I don't think it's going to last. Conference realignment is nowhere near done. It seems like every offseason something new is coming. I think you're right that the regular season championship means less than it ever has because there's no way to balance the schedules. And realistically, teams are going to win this league because they got a big schedule break at some point.
Right.
But I think big picture, what I will say, I'm optimistic that all 4 of these new ads will raise the competitive level of the conference in basketball. And obviously USC with football and Oregon with football will do the same. But, UCLA is a blue blood. Like, if I'm sure UCLA is going nowhere, regardless of how the Mick Cronin era ends. And I think, if these schools were going to be up for bid, it's a pretty good one to add that raises the prestige of Big Ten basketball, in my opinion. And I think, at least in the short term, Dana Altman's a great coach. I think maybe the biggest indictment on him recently is not figuring out Khalil Ware, but he always runs good stuff and has good teams. I think USC, at minimum, Eric Musselman's terrifying. It might take him a year to get his roster back, but he does things so differently from everyone else in the Big Ten that there's a big window for him to come in and capitalize. And I think Washington's probably the weak link, but even Washington has a brand new coach that might be really good. So all in all, I think all 4 have a chance to end up middle of the pack to upper half of the league teams and programs on an ongoing basis. And at minimum, it will make things interesting and maybe put some pressure on some of those coaches I were talking about that don't want to use the tools at their disposal. They're going to have to figure it out because Eric Musselman certainly will use those tools.
Yeah, Musselman, he's probably going to end up shirtless on a scorer's table, standing up in a Big Ten arena after a big road win this year. Mick Cronin doesn't lack for energy on the sidelines. He's going to be fun to watch. And I agree with you. I mean, Dana Altman is a really good coach. He was someone that when Indiana's job's been open in the past, like I've done those hot boards and stuff. Like he's been a name that's just kind of been on the fringe. Like you always look at him and you're like, why am I looking at Dana Altman? Well, you look at his record. He's always been a really good coach. And I think it's what Danny Sprinkle that came over to Washington.
Yep.
He's done some nice. I mean, obviously they had a huge ad with Great Osabar, I think it was that big NIL package. They've got a really nice incoming freshman in Zoom Diallo, so they'll be competitive too. So I think from a basketball perspective, it's not like when they brought in Rutgers and it was like the Eddie Jordan days when it was like you could go on the road and beat Rutgers by 35 early on. It was like the scheduled win that you had. So none of these games are going to be easy. I think it makes it more competitive. I just don't like the amount of teams and some of the other annoying things that I mentioned. But Greg, where can listeners to Podcast on the Brink check out your work and what you and Carter are doing over at Sleepers Media?
Yeah, appreciate it. This was really fun. We go by Sleepers Media. Our YouTube channel is where you can find most of our work. We do daily podcast episodes Monday through Friday, and then a bunch of short form, like 10-minute long videos on transfer portal additions, latest rumors. We're getting into NBA draft season as well, trying to do a lot of prospect breakdowns. So Sleepers Media is where you can find us. And thanks for having me on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
Are you going to be able to keep this grind on through the whole summer? Like, is there going to be a moment when the content dries up at all? That's one thing I think about all the time, like with Inside the Hall. I mean, obviously covering Indiana basketball 365 days a year, there's usually always something you can come up with, but I'm curious from your perspective, like what happens after the NBA draft?
We're going to try. We have a tentative content strategy right now that does not include any significant gaps in it, but
awesome.
The short form is going to be a lot of NBA stuff through June and July, into a lot of season preview stuff after that, maybe some transfer portal player previews and class breakdowns. So more to come for sure. But at some point I will take a week off and just sleep for a week.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for listening. As always, the Podcast on the Brink. Thanks, Greg, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. As I said, keep up the great work. I'm really enjoying everything you guys are doing over there at Sleepers Media. If you enjoy Podcast on the Brink, please leave us a rating or a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.